Being on a couple more, but I think we
Okay.
can just get going and I can admit them.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, good morning and welcome to you all. I think I know some of the faces around today's virtual session, but for those who don't know me, I'm Alexia Haramis and I head up the corporate and international development at the Edinburgh Chamber. It's a pleasure for me to chair today's Edinburgh Chamber roundtable discussion in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, who are one of our key strategic partners. This particular session will focus on the benefits of better questioning in the workplace, including an introduction to the questioning strengths method, which is a new personal development and assessment program. It has been developed for businesses and organizations over the past year in an exciting partnership between Dr. Lanny Watson from the University of Edinburgh and Oxford and Ian Robson from Success Methods. I think we can all get better results from the questions we ask in our everyday working life. And I believe some of you have taken part in completing a QSA questioning strengths assessment, which will provide feedback on your questioning strengths, which is great. I'm delighted to see such a great cross-section of organizations sign up to attend today's session, as I think this should really make an interesting discussion to see how this program can be used in different scenarios within different organizations to help improve productivity, efficiency, innovation. Before I introduce our speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you can please remain on mute during the presentation and put up your electronic hand to join in the Q&A session or insert a question in the chat box. Today's roundtable will consist of a 20 minutes, approximately 20 minutes presentation by Ian and Lanny, followed by an opportunity for Q&A. Ian has just said he's very happy to be interrupted, I think, during the presentation. So if there's anything particular, that crops up during the presentation, also very happy for people to come in as well. We really want to encourage everyone to come forwards and to make this session as interactive as possible. So I'm pleased to say we're joined today by Ian Robson. Ian has had a 30-year career in customer-facing roles, working for a wide range of software companies, including Oracle and Salesforce, during which time he's worked as an individual contributor, a chief customer officer, and just about everything in between. For the last 3 years, he's been running Success Methods, which provides training, coaching, and consulting services to a range of software and technology companies. Ian will be kicking off today's presentation and will be followed by Dr. Lanny Watson, a philosopher who studies questions and questioning. She has been writing, thinking, and talking about questions for the past 10 years. So I think we're definitely in good hands today, most of which has been spent at the University of Edinburgh, where she developed the questioning strengths method with Ian. She is now a research fellow at the University of Oxford, where she is continuing to work with diverse groups across education, business, and industry. I will now hand over to Ian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alexia. So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. Today we want to introduce, as Alexia has said, the questioning strengths method, which is a proprietary research-based assessment and training framework developed by Lanny and myself over more or less the last 2 years in a collaboration with the University of Edinburgh. Thank you, as I've said, for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate you being with us. And as Alexia said, I've spent over 30 years in a variety of customer-facing roles and felt for much of that time that good questioning is underutilized and less common than it would be in an ideal world. As it happens, as part of the work that I do at Success Methods, I wanted to develop a course on professional conversations. And as part of that, obviously wanting to look into the important role of questioning. So I went looking for some research into questioning, and luckily for me, I found Lanny, who, as Alexia said, has been researching this area for 10 years, most of that time at Edinburgh and now at Oxford. And so what was initially an approach for me to see if I could pick her brain, just to help with that little bit of my course, turned into this fascinating 2-year collaboration, a real meeting of minds, I think, and it's been an absolute joy to be part of this for that period of time. So it culminated in the QSM. What is the QSM?
Okay, so the QSM is a purpose-built framework designed to help everyone understand and harness the powerful benefits of better questioning. And our goal really is just to help people recognize the power and the potential of better questioning, and help them develop the skills and the practices that they need to become better questioners. So today we're going to talk about the wide-ranging benefits of better questioning for businesses and organizations in particular. We'll provide an overview of the questioning strengths method, and we'll explain the questioning strength assessment, which you've all, or most of you have taken. Thanks for taking the time to do that. And the questioning strengths assessment is at the heart of the method. So we'll look at the questioning strengths themselves and hopefully help you to interpret the results of your own assessment. But most importantly, we want to just open up for discussion and learn from you where questions and questioning feature in your role or in your organization. We'd love to hear your views on the assessment. And we really just want to try to understand how the QSM might be able to help you and might be able to help others improve performance through better questioning.
Thanks, Lani. So I'd just like you to pause for a moment and see if you can remember the last question you asked. So in my experience, this isn't always easy to do. I can't remember the last question I asked. And we don't often consciously notice or reflect on questions, and there's a good reason for that. They are ubiquitous. We're asking questions all the time about any number of things, and we learn to do it habitually from a very young age. 2-year-olds, as anyone who's met one will know, are constantly asking questions, most often preceded with why daddy or why mummy. And you know that continues hopefully for most of us into our adult life. We become active and persistent questioners. So the habit is so ubiquitous, so important, it's really hard to imagine getting through a day without asking a whole set of questions. And it's that very ubiquity that we believe is why we don't often stop to consider how better questioning can lead to a whole range of benefits, or indeed how we can develop into better questioners. So if we start by examining the many ways we can use questions, it soon becomes obvious that improving our questions and questioning could lead to many benefits in many areas of life. As we can see, questions can get us facts and information we need exactly when we need it. It can allow us to learn from each other, build relationships, collaborate effectively. They can help us solve problems, create solutions. They can help us innovate. They focus our attention on immediate issues, but they can also just as powerfully help us focus on the long-term challenges that we face. They can help us show concern for others and put them at ease. They can spark debate. They can challenge the status quo, they can persuade, they can provoke, they can empower, and they can simplify. So extraordinary range of things we do with questions, perhaps without really realizing just how effective a tool they are in everyday life. So just to take an example here of a very simple example of better questioning, questions help us get from A to B. So for example, we can ask, when is the next train to Glasgow? We could also ask, what's the quickest train to Glasgow? And we might even ask, which train should I catch to get to Glasgow as soon as possible? So in this simple example, it's actually entirely possible that all three of those questions have a different answer. And if that's the case, and we need to get to Glasgow in a hurry, then one of them is definitely the best of the questions. And we can easily apply that same approach to every question that we have here, every example that we have here. By considering exactly what we want to achieve with our question and formulating it and asking it accordingly, we can turn what might be a frustrating experience, which would be catching the train that meanders via every station slowly to Glasgow, into the experience we want, which is catching the train that gets us there as early as possible. So we've listed some of the ways of using questions we've just mentioned. And as you run your eyes down this list, you might remember times when you challenged someone and actually you sparked hostility rather than the debate you were hoping for, or you didn't ever quite get to the root of the facts and information that you were trying to uncover through questioning, or maybe you just couldn't get someone to see or agree with your particular point of view. And there'll be very few people amongst us who haven't ever found themselves wishing just for more effective communication. And better questioning, we believe, is a fundamental part of achieving all of these outcomes. They can help us get better results in all sorts of situations. And the good news is, like any tool, the effectiveness of questioning depends on the skill of the user. And that's a skill that can be developed and trained in all of us in order to get the most from the questions we ask. And that's precisely what the QSM is designed to help us do. So what is the QSM and how does it work? Just to repeat, it's a purpose-built framework designed to help everyone understand and harness the powerful benefits of better questioning. And what we've done is put together a 5-piece framework, essentially. At the heart of it is the assessment. So I think you have all done the assessment. You've all received your results, and we'll talk about that more later. But obviously the QSM is much more than just an assessment. It's a complete framework, as we've said. So having done the assessment and understood your own questioning strengths profile, by these 4 other elements, we can help develop better questioning in all of our partners and colleagues. So first of all, we have the Academy, and that's really all about understanding the theory of better questioning, the research behind the QSM and the QSA. We take this theory and research as a foundation for our entire framework. So the Academy is where we help people learn about the art and science of questioning, where participants can get a chance to dive into their questioning strengths report, learn about their own unique combination of strengths and how to apply them. The Gym is where we can help participants develop their questioning strengths. So using simple, repeatable exercises, and by sharing a lot of tried and tested tips and techniques, we can actually help people focus in on developing individual strengths or strengths in combination. Theatre is where we provide a place for practice. So in a supported group environment, we use our theatre exercises to let participants see how questioning strengths actually play out in real life. You're given a chance to use the strengths. You might be trying to recognize strengths in others. And often if that means using unfamiliar strengths, this can be a really informative and exciting exercise or set of exercises to take part in. And then finally, we have the workshop, which is where really the hard work gets done. So what we're trying to do is take everything that you've absorbed through the Academy, through the Gym and through the theatre, and actually apply that to real world situations. So we're looking to help the people we work with build practical question-based outputs. So previously, for example, we've worked with De Montfort Student University to build a set of questions that were taken by some of the student representatives into a meeting with academics to try and understand why they wanted to make a quite controversial change to the way that we're applying academic penalties. So to help prepare them for that, we help them work with help them build a set of questions, thinking about which questioning strengths they would use in that meeting in order to have as effective an output, hopefully, as possible. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to do in the Academy, work with people to build question-based outputs or questioning frameworks. So leaving the workshop, as we say, you might have the DSU example, you might have an employee satisfaction survey, you might have prepared a set of marketing questions to understand personas in marketing, you might have prepared for a challenging professional conversation, a coaching session, all sorts of things can potentially be generated as outputs from the workshop. And we see this as essential because what we're really focused on with the QSM is making it practical. There's a lot of theory behind it, but ultimately for us, what we want to help people do is ask better questions and use better questioning techniques. And so we're very focused on actually generating practical outputs to support that.
Okay, so thanks, Ian. You've heard a little bit about the overall framework of the QSM, and now we just want to dive a little bit deeper into the questioning strengths assessment itself. And thanks again to everyone for taking the assessment. We hope you found it interesting to just think about the way that you ask questions. And of course, we think there's plenty more value to be had from learning more about the assessment and about how to interpret the results. So the questioning strengths assessment is a validated self-report measure, and it provides you with an insight into your unique combination of questioning strengths. And essentially it offers a way to understand how you are inclined to use questions, where your strengths in questioning lie, and where you have opportunities to ask questions in new ways or adopt different, less familiar types of questioning. So the QSA was developed and tested by Ian and myself over the course of about a year, I think it took. We began by actively charting different types of questions and correlating these with distinct approaches to questioning using a combination of observational and analytical techniques. And we began, I think, probably with a set of 3 strengths that went up to about 12 at one point, I think, and we eventually settled on the 9 distinct questioning strengths that now form the assessment. And in order to confirm the observation and analysis that we'd done, we then went on to test and validate the QSA using some sort of standard empirical measures. So we ran 2 development rounds and 1 large pilot of the assessment before finalizing the strongest and therefore the most predictive items on the assessment. And these items now form the final validated self-assessment tool. So the QSA and the research behind it is, as we've said, at the heart of the QSM. And that's why we regard it as the starting point for harnessing the powerful benefits of better questioning. So as you know, the tool gives you an insight into where you stand with respect to the 9 questioning strengths, but you might be interested in hearing more about what the questioning strengths actually are. So in essence, a questioning strength is a distinctive skill in the art of questioning. And I think it's kind of easy to forget that questioning is a skill, because like we've said, we use it so often and we learn it at such a young age. It's a completely habitual part of the way that we think and speak to each other. But of course, with any skill, no matter how ubiquitous and familiar it is, people can be better or worse at using it. So they can be better or worse at asking questions, and people can use questions in very different ways to achieve completely different results. So each of the 9 questioning strengths identifies a distinct approach to questioning, and each of these approaches can be used effectively to achieve better questioning overall. As I just said, the 9 questioning strengths have been identified and validated using standard empirical measures, and each has a set of specific intentions and specific behaviours that are associated with the strength. And we've tried to capture those in the short descriptions that you received in your report and in the keywords that you can see here. So the investigator is systematic and meticulous, the explorer is creative and curious, the philosopher is thoughtful, abstract, and so on. And then in addition, each of the questioning strengths is associated with a particular role for questioning. And we've identified 4 key roles for questioning. These were also in the report. So knowledge seeking, problem solving, relationship building, and assumption challenging, plus the role of the internalizer, which when used as a strength can be characterized as active listening. So these roles add a kind of further layer of insight when you're interpreting the results of the questioning strengths assessment. So you might find, for example, that you're very strong in both of the knowledge seeking roles, say, but less confident with the assumption challenging roles or something along those lines. Perhaps the most important thing to know about the questioning strengths is that context is the key to using them effectively. So very similar questions, or even, as you can see here, the exact same question can achieve very different results depending on the context in which you ask the question. So that includes who you ask, when and where you ask, how you ask, and why you're asking. So great questioners are able to move between the different strengths according to the context. So the engager is asking, you know, what do you think's going on here? What do you want? What do you think we should do, for example? The interrogator might be asking, what are you thinking? You know, to try and get to the bottom of something that they think is not quite adding up. The explorer might ask the exact same question, but with a kind of curious mindset. What are you thinking here? The inquirer might literally just want to know, what are you thinking? The philosopher, of course, wants to know what is thinking. The persuader, are you thinking what I'm thinking, right? The internalizer doesn't say it, but is thinking, what on earth is he thinking? These are all kind of different examples of how very similar questions, depending on context, can come through in different questioning strengths. And it's moving between these strengths adeptly according to context. That's how we get the most out of every questioning opportunity.
So we want to touch just briefly here on interpreting the assessment, because we have plenty of time for discussion, and we're happy in that session to take any and all questions that anybody has about their own particular profile. But there's a couple of things that are interesting from our perspective that hopefully you'll also find interesting. So we maintain a global picture of questioning strengths, and this is based on data gathered from just under 500 assessments now. And one of the reasons we do this is it can be fascinating to compare the global results to any given organization. I mentioned De Montfort University Student Union, who we work with, and obviously those are student-facing teams. The union particularly, you know, the staff there spend the vast majority of their time talking with students, and those are often students who are in, you know, stressful situations where, you know, the ability to really get to a clear understanding of what's happening for that student is vital. And what was great for the guys at the union, and what was fascinating, I think, for us to see, was how highly they scored in Engager and Explorer. Excuse me, which are two strengths that we think correlate very well with coaching behaviors. So, you know, the Engager, obviously to put people at ease, students in a stressful situation, for example, and then the Explorer to gently tease out and work away at what's actually bothering them and really explore with them what might be going on for them. So they scored very highly on those two questions, and that was kind of fascinating for them as a group, and reassuring, I think, because they felt, hey, you know, we've got the actual questioning strengths we need for this role. What was also fascinating for them in the comparison was how low they scored on provocateur. So as a group, they were extremely low on the provocateur strength. And during the discussions we had with them, they came to realize that potentially was holding them back a bit in terms of internal discussions and teamwork, because nobody was really prepared to challenge the status quo. And one of the things that we talked about with them was this notion we have of questioning strengths capes. So a little bit like De Bono's thinking hats, but capes instead of hats, was when you go into a meeting, ask somebody to wear the provocateur's cape, so that in a kind of safe way, they can be the person who's enabled or empowered to ask the more provocative questions in a meeting, to make sure that, you know, some of the status quo type stuff is effectively challenged. And that's one of the interesting things that we have in most discussions we have with the groups that we work with, is comparing them to themselves to the global averages, and seeing where they're strong and weak can be, you know, the basis of really productive discussions about how they might change the way they use the various strengths that are represented in their groups. So Lanny's kind of touched on this, but really the QSA is measuring really two things, but telling you three. So it's trying to measure how inclined you are to use a particular strength, and how effective you are in the use of that strength. So we base a lot of our item creation, the item is kind of the technical term for the questions that you're asked, on intents and behaviors, so, you know, inclinations, and then how effective you are to use the strength. But it's also showing you where you've got opportunities to ask questions in new ways, or adopt less familiar, perhaps less comfortable types of questioning that might actually be valuable parts of your questioning toolkit. You know, and these of course are all connected. And I think it's very true that, you know, to bring in a bit of philosophy here, we've got Lanny with her multiple years of philosophy under her belt. As Aristotle says, developing good habits is the key to developing strengths, and I think, you know, we see that, you know, the more you use a particular strength, the more likely you are to become good at it. So if you're inclined to ask explorer questions, you will hopefully in time get good at asking those explorer questions. Okay, so just before we open up for discussion, Lana, you've appeared to have frozen for me, so hopefully you can kick the slide forward. No, I think she's completely, here we go, there we go, thank you. So just before we open up for discussion, we thought we'd share a few thoughts on how better questioning, how we believe better questioning can improve performance. So we've talked about some of the benefits of better questioning, but what about if we apply those to specific situations? What might we expect? So it may not surprise you, given how ubiquitous questions are and how much we've talked about that ubiquity, that we see opportunities to improve performance through better questioning in many parts of an organization. And I'll touch on a few of those now. So, for example, sales performance, which we, some of the strengths that we think suit that particularly well would be persuader and investigator. Somebody who's high in investigator, the investigator strength is almost certainly going to be good at asking the kind of structured, meticulous questioning that's needed for really good consultative selling. That inclination and expertise to use that approach and keep going, which is a kind of characteristic of investigator, until they've built a really clear and full picture of a customer's potential requirements, is a really valuable part of effective selling. And then if you throw in a bit of persuader to make sure that they ask, perhaps some of the right leading questions, you have a really good and well-rounded set of strengths for selling. We touched on this a moment ago, but for marketing, both survey questions, making sure that you're building, perhaps, this is the kind of thing that would come out of the workshop, a really effective set of survey questions. But also things like building personas, building client personas and, asking the right questions, to ensure we really know what customers expect from us and also what they're experiencing today. And then, we have a whole bunch of other areas. I'm not going to touch on them all because there's a chance for us to spend time in discussion, which I think we'd like to get to. But things like team dynamics, we talked a little bit about the absence of provocateur at the Montfort University Student Union and how actually adding a bit of that in a safe way could be really helpful to the team dynamic. But also if you've got very few engagers in a team dynamic, you might have fractious conversations, and actually thinking about how you can bring your engager into team dynamics can potentially also help with resolving maybe some of the challenges you might have in team situations. Recruitment, and this is really interesting for us actually. It's not something we've done much on yet, but one of the things that I think we find fascinating about this whole approach is if you can benchmark the questioning strengths of the highest performers in any given role in your organization. So for example, if you can, if you're running a call center, let's say, and you can identify that inquirers are achieving the fastest call handling time because their inclination is to ask direct, straightforward questions, it may be that there's a good case for at least testing for that during your recruitment process. So you're making sure that as part of recruitment, you're hiring people in with the questioning strengths that best fit the requirements of the role. And then finally, just across an organization, I think we see potentially frontline staff being those who, as I've just said, you might want to pair their strengths specifically with a job or help them develop the strengths that are most helpful in their job. Middle management, who are often about coaching and development, you might want to make sure those people are really thinking about using Explorer and Engager to ensure, they focus the right amount of attention on questioning scenarios and strengths as part of the discussion, which, hopefully if the frontline staff are also thinking about it, it becomes a natural thing to talk about. And leadership, one of the things I've seen in my career is leadership teams can often have a lot of strong personalities, and actually sometimes thinking about the way that questions and questioning are being used in leadership contexts might again help that team dynamic. So we think at all layers of the organization, again, because questions are so ubiquitous and so commonly used, that a better appreciation of their use and perhaps some thinking about better questioning can can deliver benefits at really all levels of an organization. So just to finish, Larry's just going to run you through a little bit of the early feedback that we've had from the sessions we've run today.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and I don't have a huge amount to say here. We just wanted to put up, give you a sense of some of the feedback that we've been getting from some of the early kind of sessions that we've been running. And as we've said, it's all very early days for us going out and really testing with teams, and we're really kind of looking forward to working with more teams, more organizations. This is kind of a sense of what the type of feedback that we're getting back, and this is just a small selection really, but people are finding the questionnaire to be a kind of insightful and useful tool, helping them to think about how they're using questions, the way that they can move between different questioning strengths, the way that they can work on questioning strengths that are less familiar or less comfortable, like we've said. It's helped to make the most of team meetings and project work. That's one of the kind of most common things I think we've heard in the feedback, is that it's actually a very, it's a non-confrontational way to work across teams. So if you're asking questions and you're encouraging your team to ask questions, as opposed to everyone being expected to have answers, that has a kind of interesting effect on the team dynamic, and including on the kind of power dynamic within a team or within a relationship. It can help to sort of equalize and help people get their voices heard and represented. So yeah, I think we've been getting some great feedback, and we're really excited to try to extend further and work further with more teams and other organisations. And that's really what we'd love to hear from you now, about whether you think this could be of interest, what strikes you as interesting, what strikes you as useful, what strikes you as less interesting, and all of the feedback. So thanks very much for listening, and I think I'll hand back to Alexia now, who's going to chair our Q&A discussion.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting, so much information there. You've really given us a lot of food for thought. So if we can now please open up the Q&A, please. I think there is one question from Saj just before she had to leave the call, and that was with regards to what percentage do you class as high?
For a strength?
Yes, I'm presuming that must be.
That's a good question. I don't think we've kind of categorized it in quite that way. I suppose we're comparing against the global average. So in each case, according to the global average, there will be a different real term in sense in which it's high or low, because it will be high or low relative to the average. So that's one of the things that is actually really, like Ian was saying, really useful about looking at the global average compared to the average across a team or as an individual. Comparing yourself to that, I think, can be quite helpful. But yeah, I don't think we've categorized each strength in terms of high, low, medium, but maybe that would be an interesting bit of information to give people.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, actually, and I don't know whether or not people would be interested to know, but we literally see 0 to 100 in the population we've surveyed on pretty much every strength. So I, for example, am 100 on Explorer. We have somebody on today who I think is 100 in Provocateur. We've seen people who are 0 on strengths. So you get a really wide range in the population. As you probably remember from the chart that I showed, certain strengths seem to show up more in the population, probably aligning with what you might intuit. But yeah, the strength, that's a really interesting question, the high, low, medium thing, that, as Niall says, we haven't really laid that frame on it yet.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about how you calculate the strength?
Yes. Do you want to do that, Lani, or do you want me?
Yeah, so calculate the strength in terms of come up with the number, the percentage number. Yeah. Ian, I'll hand over to you there.
So yeah, basically behind the assessment, well, you answered all the questions as part of taking the survey. So those 90 questions, I think, it's something like, I think, is it 6 or 7, Lani? I think there's 12 internalizer,
6 or 7, yeah.
questions per 7 questions per strength. So essentially, we're just looking at what you're scoring on each of the items that correlates with any given strength, and taking a percentage of the total that you may have achieved. So if you answered what's at the top of the Likert scale, Lani? Remind me. Most
very like me, yeah.
Yeah, very like. If you answered very like me on all the provocateur questions, then you would score 100%. Essentially, if you answered very unlike me on them, you'd score 0.
So that's kind of a part of how it takes a long time to develop the actual items or the questions in the assessment, because the goal is to essentially get items that correlate distinctively with only one questioning strength and no other questioning strength. So you have to, that's why, you start with more potential strengths, and then you pare down, and you start with more items, and then you pare down, so that you end up with, we started, I think, with 360 items in the assessment. So the people who took those first rounds were really doing us a favor. It took a long time, and they took that twice over to help us to correlate most accurately with the questioning strength, so that now each of the items correlates distinctively with the questioning strength, and that therefore they are the most predictive items. And that's why and then you run the validation tests in order to check that you're actually sort of picking out distinctions that exist in the world according to the sample.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a question from Mariki. You've got your electronic hand up. Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. And it's a little bit connected to the questions in the chat by Sally and Claire. So I facilitate meetings with teams, so I'm very interested in what you're doing. I was just wondering, if you sort of assess a team and know sort of the strengths of the team, how do you then, have you thought about how you then sort of assess what strengths need to be improved for the team to be effective, and how would you then go about training those people, giving them the tools in the gym to actually practice that? Have you developed a framework for that? I would be very interested.
Yeah, so I think, going back to the example that Ian shared a couple of times, the team at De Montfort University, one of the things, and this actually happened, we ran a pilot version of the workshop with my team here at Oxford, and a similar thing happened in a slightly different direction. But the teams, because particularly during the workshop section, which is at the moment the longest kind of section of the training that we've delivered, the teams are essentially we've got them fairly familiar through the gym and the theatre and the academy with the different questioning strengths, and then we're getting them to pick out questioning strengths that they think will be useful for the question based outputs that they're developing. So in some sense, there's a huge amount of input from the team. So at the De Montfort University, for example, they started to identify that actually there were certain situations that they were working on where the provocateur strength would be helpful, and therefore they would like to know more about how to develop that particular strength. So to some extent that was coming from them, and to some extent it will come from the results of the assessment. So if we're looking at particularly working with organizations in a very sort of individual, tailored, bespoke way, we're hoping to be I guess helping organizations understand for themselves which questioning strengths they are going to be able to use most effectively for different types, different roles, and how they can switch between them. And then in terms of developing them, we've got, you know, a bunch of techniques and tips and exercises that are all geared towards helping individuals develop the questioning strengths overall, but including individual questioning strengths. And that's something that we're hoping to work on. I mean, ideally, it would be great if we could have a whole session just on developing the engager strength or developing the provocateur strength. And I think that's something we'd definitely be looking to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning that I think Alexia, I think, probably said this at the beginning. We're fairly early in our journey here. You know, 2 years, a lot of that time was developing the assessment. And just to kind of add to what Lani said here, one of the things that's quite noticeable about some of the reactions to just the assessment is, in its own way, it can be a catalyst for change. And a fascinating example of that, which will stick with me forever, I think, was one of Lani's colleagues at Oxford, who had filled in the assessment and raised the question and said, you know, I'm really surprised. I was really surprised by this because I was scored really quite low on provocateur. And I think I'm a really provocative character. And so I was quite taken aback by the assessment, but having reflected on it, I realized that I'm provocative with statements. I'm not provocative with questions. And actually provocative questions are probably much easier to handle for an audience and much more productive than provocative statements, which, you know, are just left out there for people to kind of absorb and not necessarily easily react to. And I think that was a bit of a light bulb moment for that individual. And you know, I think, you know, Lani can probably attest to the fact that that's changed the way that he operates in a team dynamic. So there's a very much a kind of a personal dynamics type thing can be affected, I think, just by understanding the strength profile and reflecting on it. And we have endless opportunity, we think, to develop. I mean, we could be at this for the rest of our careers, developing things off the back of this that we can then take to organizations to help them, or individuals to help them develop individual strengths. As Lani said, you can envisage an entire workshop just on Engager, just on Explorer, building on some of the stuff that we have today. But we're still quite early. So I think one of the things that excites us is finding people who are kind of interested in this and might want to partner a little bit on developing some of these things. You know, where they've got very specific things that, you know, that where this might apply.
Thank you. I've got a question from John Wilkinson, an interesting one. Ian and Lani, developing this method, how has this changed your own ability in the workplace and in life?
That is a great question. I think that's a tricky one for me because I'm so obsessed with thinking and talking about questions. I've been doing that for so long now. But actually developing the assessment, I mean, it started out as a much smaller project, didn't it, Ian? And we thought, you know, this could be a kind of fun way to get people interested in questions and thinking about their own questioning. And actually it ballooned into this huge exercise in developing the assessment as a really central part of the method, precisely because we started to realize actually this is becoming very useful. So in particular, I mean, I'm for sure seeing, for example, I score unsurprisingly highly on the philosopher strength, which is useful for me in my role as a philosopher, but is often not useful in my role as a wife, for example. Or some other kind of personal roles, but also professional roles in different, like with different contexts. And it's really helped me to understand, like really think through, okay, what actually is my approach here? Am I asking questions that are gonna, you know, just kind of miss the point precisely because they're sort of too abstracted or they're not getting at the details, whereas I need to actually pick out the details, and then I can really consciously think in my head, you need to be an investigator now. And sometimes, and particularly in my team now, because they're familiar with the questioning strengths, people in the team will say, including myself, you know, I'm going to just ask an investigator question here because I really, and those investigative questions can come across as quite sort of almost pedantic or pernickety if you don't premise it with that sort of, I guess, disclaimer that you're deliberately taking on a style here because you want to get to the root of something, and everyone in the team kind of understands that that's what you're doing. So I think there are probably two things. One, at the level of how I'm thinking about consciously my own approach, even beyond all the thinking that I've been doing about questions. And then secondly, being able to articulate it to a team and they understand what I'm saying. I don't know if Ian, you have other things to add.
So it is a great question. And I think I said at the beginning, I've been thinking about questioning myself for a long time and often wondered why I'm the only person in a room asking questions. So I've been kind of a real fan of questions for a long time. To specifically answer that, it has changed me though, which is fascinating in a couple of ways. One is I think more now about the questions that I ask. So I'm a consultant, that I ask in client-facing situations, but also when I'm working with clients. So for example, one of my current clients, we've been developing surveys, as it happens, because they're trying to better understand the customer experience that their customers are having. And actually through working with Lani and improving my own understanding of questions and questioning structure, we've been able to really, I think, dramatically improve some of the surveys that are coming out of the initial process of, you get lots of compound questions and things that you think, well, that's really not answering what we're trying to achieve with that and whatnot. So one of the things Lani and I have in one of our workshops is a kind of questioning structure. So we call it question forming, storming. So basically it's a question development technique. And informally now I use that with clients as well to help make sure they understand, before you start creating questions for a survey, what do you want the survey to achieve? So let's bring that right back. So it's really helped me focus, I think, more on what questions are actually for and why we're using them and what it is we want to achieve as a result of them, rather than just as I might have done before, oh great, let's dive in and create some questions, which was probably a little bit more of my modus operandi before. So yeah.
Brilliant, Ian. Thank you. I'm just conscious we've got quite a few questions coming in here. Just very quickly working my way through. Claire Pembleton, will there be a cultural effect on this? Some cultures may favour or value some styles of questioning more than others.
Yeah, well, I want to speak to that I won't go on for too long, so it'd be great to get through all these. But it's a really interesting question. That's something in my research that I'd really like to be able to spend more time doing, and the more data that we can collect, the easier it's going to be to get. We do collect some of that demographic data. I mean, it's optional, but most people seem to give it. And so we will be able to, with more data, start to make some kind of assessment of that. But one example from my own team, certainly one of my colleagues comes from Bangladesh, and she has talked quite a bit after the workshop about using the roles, not just the strengths, but the actual roles, talking about knowledge seeking versus assumption challenging. And she has said in her cultural context, in her cultural background, that questions are kind of taken to be provocative, usually, like they're assumption challenging always. And so that's a form of questioning that she's kind of grown up being told is how you use questions, and she's now seeing that there are these other roles for questions, knowledge seeking or relationship building, that she hadn't really perceived before. And she has, I'm just reporting what she has said to me, but that said that is a distinctive kind of cultural effect that she thinks, she wants us to go over and work with her colleagues in Bangladesh. And I think something like that would be very interesting, certainly interesting to me in my research and to us overall.
Brilliant, thank you, Lani. And Sally Brading, if you wanted to improve a certain questioning method to be a better interrogator, for example, can you provide a framework on how to improve this?
Go ahead, Ian.
So it's a little related to, I think, Marika's question around, are we yet in a position to run specific strength workshops? We're not. I think what we have found, just to use a previous example again, the Montfort University, I think I'd mentioned earlier, had quite a challenging meeting coming up where they were very focused on understanding an academic, a change that the academic community wanted to make that would affect their students. And actually, that was one of the things they focused on in the workshop, was building that list of questions. And they spontaneously realized that actually they needed to be in interrogator mode and asking questions using that strength. And that alone was enough for them to go off and actually generate a different set of questions and a mindset for the meeting that they would not otherwise, I think, have had. So, yes, but a qualified yes at this point. I think, you know, we can work with you on that, and I think the awareness itself is important, but we don't yet have detailed frameworks for developing individual skills out to their fullest potential.
One thing just to add on that quickly, I've recently been contacted by someone who has been trained in interrogation techniques and very interested in working with us, Ian. So I think there's like a really interesting, particularly with the interrogator style, a really interesting, because there are really serious, tricks of the trade, if you like, in that world that, hopefully we can learn from and understand a little bit more about how those work, and then use them in our own way, which is perhaps less, less sinister, but still very effective. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lani. And if I can just bring Alan in, please. I can see your hand up.
Right. Thanks very much, Alexia. The method is currently based on self-assessment. Have you done any observational or studies, a third party, watching or videoing a meeting and analysing behaviours and questions? Or have you done any sort of 360 assessment of peers, superiors, people that report to somebody to try and get a view? Because obviously self-assessment is self-assessment.
Yes, it's such a good question. We are intending to develop a slightly shorter version of the QSA that would be used in a 360 context, peer assessment context. And I personally think that would be an incredibly valuable sort of rich way to build out the tool, especially for teams and organizations.
Yeah, and just picking up on teams, have you thought about the relationship with Belbin and other team related structures, if you like?
Not a huge amount, I would say. Ian, I don't know whether you've been engaged.
I would say not from my perspective. We've been pretty focused on getting this to the point where we've got something that's practically useful, and how do we take that forward? So not yet, but I mean, certainly anything that's going to help us turn this into something that is practically useful and relatable is something we would want to look at in time.
Okay, thanks.
Brilliant. We've got a question from John. Do you switch your questioning style depending on who you're talking to, taking into account their personality?
So there's something really fascinating and lovely about that question. And personally, one of the things that I wish I'd had this 25 years ago, because I used to interrogate my kids, and I really wish I hadn't done it. I really wish I'd engaged them when they were digging a hole in the garden and I wanted to know what they were doing, rather than interrogating them. So I think absolutely. I think having a mindset of what do I want to get from this conversation, and what's the outcome that I want, what is the appropriate strength to use, that really underpins some of the workshop type stuff that we did. I mean, that's actually one of the exercises, is what strengths are appropriate for this particular scenario. And that could be to do with what you're trying to achieve, who the personalities are. So, absolutely. And I think one of the things, again, that can be tricky is to, particularly in the early stages, is to just switch mindfully. I think we switch automatically. To switch mindfully can be a little bit challenging maybe at the beginning because you're less familiar. But if you're preparing for something, then you absolutely can. And I think that's the beauty of what we do in the workshop, is we help people prepare for situations so that they're ready to be in the appropriate strength and have written their questions in the appropriate way to support that. So absolutely, John, and great question, and one personally I love for kind of I wish things had been different, but it's fascinating to reflect on.
Thank you, Ian. And another question from Denise Grant. Will there be scope to have a one-to-one to get feedback on your QSA and how the results impact your current role industry sector?
Is that question, so I'm not sure if that's specifically sort of in relation to this particular call. I think essentially we'd love to have a conversation with anyone on this call, anyone who's interested in following up on particular results and on particularly in different contacts in different roles in different sectors. So yes, definitely scope for that in this call, and hopefully more generally we'd be able to do that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've got Kenneth Redmond with his hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I was just a general innovative question. I was just to see if you thought it was along the right lines of what we were discussing. I was going to ask, like, as an innovative, I'd say to his client, this is a question, what exactly in detail do you want to build? Like, there was two parts to the question, but I wasn't sure, like, if that was a direct question to use, but it was just to see what other people thought.
That sounds like a classic investigator question to me, a kind of like really getting at the details, and a good question if that's, you know, precisely what you're shooting at, trying to understand. Yeah, so it sounds like a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Alexia.
Sorry, I was on mute then. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time. We've only got a couple of minutes. So are there any other questions from anyone before we wrap up? That's been a really interesting discussion. Well, as Ian...
Can I ask the, sorry,
yes,
to ask the 100% question. So how are you going to make money out of this?
We are already. So we have an initial workshop which we've run in pilot, and now we're running commercially, questioning strengths foundations, and then we're planning to develop a whole set of additional ones where we think a focus on questioning would have real value for organizations. So
have you thought about using it in educational settings? Because I know in the International Baccalaureate curriculum there is a critical thinking course, and it's like brilliant to do it there.
Yeah, I think certainly a lot of my research has been based in education context and looking at questions in the relationship between teachers and students asking questions, and actually worked with the International Baccalaureate recently. They're trying to include curiosity as a trait that they developed through the IB, and I think that, yeah, there's a great fit there. It'd be brilliant to work with them. There's a group at Oxford that are working on that, so hopefully there's so many opportunities.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Lani and Ian. Thank you so much for your time today and your very interesting insights. It's been a really interesting discussion. And what we'll do is we'll definitely link you all up with Lani and Ian. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or wants to link up, we'll make sure that we connect you up. Thank you all so much for attending today. And I hope you all have a lovely day. We'll be in touch.